I'd like to begin by thanking the organisers for everything they've done over the past few months for this conference. I think it's been a really fascinating 2 days, and part of that obviously is down to the other participants as well. To echo what George has already said, I do think there's been some incredibly interesting presentations, and it's been really very stimulating. So I'm going to be slightly indulgent and talk about a paper that remains incredibly important to me in my own work. It's a paper that I first encountered when I was a master's student doing the Masters in Social Psychology at the London School of Economics. It was a paper that was on Rob Farr's reading list on a course that I was taking on the history of social psychology. And I vividly remember the first time I read this paper, Society and Theory in Social Psychology, because it seemed to encapsulate so many of the concerns and the sort of the vague thoughts that I'd had about social psychology right the way through my undergraduate career, but had never really articulated in any particular way. I've returned to that paper many times over the course of the last many years now. I think it's a clear, coherent, persuasive, polemical project paper. And I've decided to revisit it partly here today because I want to think about how much might have changed in our discipline over the last 44 years and how much has not. I mean, as I say, I return to this many times in my own work and actually also in my own teaching. In fact, on Monday morning when I'm back in Cambridge, I'm teaching an MPhil class myself where the students are actually reading this paper, hopefully, this weekend as well. Now, many people in this room will know the history of this paper better than me. Society and Theory in Social Psychology was originally published in Israel and Tajfel's edited collection, The Context of Social Psychology, which arose out of a conference of the same name. And it was reprinted in the UK in the collection edited by Gerard Devine in 2000, Social Representations, Explorations in Social Psychology. And I remember talking to Gerard when he was initially starting work on editing that collection and it being very clear right from the start just how important that paper was going to be in that collection in general. And I think it's very clear that that inclusion in that 2000 work did bring it to a wider audience. Google Scholar is not necessarily the best indication, but a quick look on Google Scholar reveals that the paper's been cited now 498 times, and 269 of those have been since the year 2000, which I think is really interesting given that this is a paper written in 1972 about the state of social psychology at that particular point, and yet in the last 16 years we've seen so many more citations. And maybe that should alert us to the fact that actually it still has relevance or resonance to our discipline today. So in the paper, Moscovici describes the purpose of that original conference as being aimed at considering a science which for some should not exist at all and for others does not exist as yet. Now, I would argue that probably that first premise, that social psychology shouldn't necessarily exist at all, probably still holds true in many contexts. I think sometimes it feels like that in the UK. We're increasingly kind of questioning the value of considering social within psychology comes under threat, especially in the face of some other approaches. Now, that second part, whether the discipline exists as yet, I think is another question. Later in this paper, Moscovici suggests that in 1972, he says, we have the stones, but we have not built the house. So in other words, we've got the data, we've got the approaches, we've got the methods, and so on, but we haven't actually made the appropriate discipline out of them. And I wonder if the house has been built now, whether it was to the order that Moscovici was outlining in this particular paper. So in this discussion, I'd like to think about some of the arguments that Moscovici makes regarding the ways in which social psychology is fractured and in factions and the causes and consequences of this. So in particular, I want to think about debates surrounding atheoreticism in the discipline, its lack of an adequate approach to the social, and finally its lack of direction in both subject matter and also in social engagement as well. Now, the paper focuses on many of the different ways in which social psychology is divided, and some of these distinctions are presented as being more tense or even antagonistic than others. Some, Moscovici points out, exist in the textbooks and people don't even seem to realise that they are actually different approaches. So I want to focus on three of these that come from this original paper. And I want to examine them and think about, as I say, their continued relevance today, but also some of the ways in which we might be moving on from this as well. So I want to think about American versus European social psychology, experimental versus non-experimental social psychology, and also this typology that Moscovici develops in this paper, taxonomic, differential, and systematic, and think about how far these distinctions still might resonate today. This is a difficult, the EU flag is a difficult image for somebody from the UK at the moment, given our recent history and decision that was taken last June. But I want to think first and foremost then about this issue of the division between American and European social psychology. Now, this is really complex, and I would argue this is a potentially very misleading issue if we take it at face value. And indeed, obviously, the presence of so many social psychologists from the US as well as Europe at this very conference suggests it's clearly not a clear-cut distinction at all. Some psychologists have questioned whether actually dividing social psychology into American and European is helpful at the outset at all. But I think it's very clear, as people like Rob Farr and also Greenwood have pointed out, that while social psychology might well have its roots in Germany, in Italy, in France and so on, the development of the discipline in pre- and post-World War II United States did take it in different directions, variously referred to either as the individualization of the social or the disappearance of the social in social psychology. Now, a review of further developments since 1972 might well seem to support a continuation of this. But I would think it would be wrong to view Moscovici's point. He's clearly not making the point that there's a straightforward kind of us versus them argument here at all. He clearly didn't want this to be read in the way that Tajfel, in a similar paper, his own plea for the development of European social psychology in 1981, talked about the problems of seeing this as being a grotesque outburst of a new European chauvinism. So I think what Moscovici, Tajfel and others were arguing is that we can't necessarily assume that social psychology that emanates from one context, whether it's American, European, elsewhere in the world, is actually necessarily going to be appropriate within a different context. The cultural, the historical, the political, the social context of the studies undertaken will always be reflected in their design, in their results, in their interpretation, their analysis, and so on. And as we reconsider this argument in 2016, I think we need to think about two issues. The first is the assumption that we still need to take sociocultural context seriously in examining and explaining all aspects of human behaviour, rather than potentially looking for universals that might be found independently of it. And this, for me, seems to be at the very heart, in many ways, of what most of us who have an interest in Moscovici's work might well continue to argue. But there's a further assumption, I think, within Moscovici's work that this cultural difference between, for example, the United States and Europe still exists. 44 years later, with an increased trend towards globalization, the sharing of vast amounts of information via the internet and social media, as we discussed in several of the sessions yesterday and so on, does that continue to be the case? So to me, while we certainly need to continue to think about social change, to take it seriously, to think about globalization as a response to this argument, that entirely and on its own would fail to appreciate a lot of the very deep-rooted, enduring aspects of culture, again, referred to this morning in some of the sessions there. And these kind of historically tenacious aspects of understanding that arise from it, and I think here, for example, of Anna Maria's work, on drawings that children in 1980s Italy are producing of madmen and the similarities that we see with medieval images there. However, characterizing these different approaches purely as American or European can lead some psychologists potentially to misunderstand this as a geographical issue, and I think that is a massive oversimplification. Moving beyond this basic designation to a much deeper appreciation of culture and the impact that it has on our discipline, on our developing discipline, is essential. So the second fracture that's discussed at length by Moscovici in this paper focuses more on methods and can be divided very broadly into the experimental and the non-experimental social psychology. Now, again, to some extent, this is misleading, and it's easy to view this in too reductionist a way. And also, again, we've seen some really great examples of experimental studies over the last 2 days as well. I think really what's at the heart of Moscovici's argument in this paper is that it's as much the positivist attitude behind some experimentation and the fact that it can lead to a fetishism regarding the kinds of research methods that we use that Moscovici's bemoaning here. And the paper argues that there's an integral but largely unacknowledged part of social psychology that focuses so much on experimentation that this effectively stunts and limits the discipline's growth and development. And a lot of this comes down to an absence of theory within social psychology, and in particular an overarching theory that would join social psychology together. And Moscovici makes it very clear in later work, for example, in his conversation with Ivana Markova in 1998, just how far these concerns link to his development of the theory of social representations. Although it's interesting that in this paper, the 1972 paper, while he does refer to his own study on social understandings of psychoanalysis and also to Claudine Herzlich's work on understandings of health and illness, he doesn't make a specific mention of representation or social representation. So for Moscovici, this fundamental divorce between theory and method means that the discipline is not advancing in the way that it should. Experiment leads to a further experiment without any adequate involvement of theory, either as the driving force or as a way of developing and explaining results, which actually reminds me, again, of what George was saying in terms of thinking about, moving from the kind of the what to the why questions as well. So what we need to recognise then is, as Moscovici puts it, experiment and theory do not stand in a transparent relation to one another. It is the role of theory to make experimentation unnecessary and the role of experimentation to render the theory impossible. The dialectic relationship that exists between these two propositions needs to be properly used if knowledge is to advance. So were these warnings and these exhortations heeded, and has the situation changed at all over the past 44 years? Well, let's first think about theory and then think about method, while of course remembering that dialectic relationship between the two that Moscovici highlights there. I think it's hard to argue that theory plays the role that it should in much social psychology in the 21st century. Many social psychologists remain atheoretical or even anti-theoretical, in my experience, in their stance. Epistemological positioning often goes unexplored and unacknowledged in the vast majority of social psychology papers. And I think it's all too easy to still recognise the social psychology that Moscovici describes in this paper. And I wonder if the much publicised replication crisis might be the result of a discipline that lacks a sufficient consideration of the link between theory and research that undertakes. We lurch from one experiment to another without consideration of either the cultural or the social context and the theoretical basis behind each study and what might actually be contributed. The experiment is still regarded as the gold standard within much of social psychology, partly because of the assumption that it allows us, falsely the assumption that it allows us to control for all variables and therefore infer causation. And some methods, especially those that might be associated more with other disciplines, other social sciences such as ethnography, are often mistrusted and misunderstood. Now, the debates, I think, have perhaps recentered somewhat onto the form of analysis that's actually used, with qualitative analysis not usually associated with experimental research, challenged as being unreliable and invalid, and quantitative analysis, often using experimental and other data, being seen as the only robust way to actually consider an issue. And the recent disputes in the UK surrounding the failure of the British Medical Journal to publish qualitative studies on the basis that they are, quote, usually exploratory by their very nature and do not provide generalizable answers, are a good example of this further fracture within social psychology. Now, Moscovici also divides social psychology into these three categories in this paper, and I think this deserves a bit of additional consideration. So these are taxonomic, differential, and systematic. They differ in their conceptualization of the subject and the object, albeit, although as Moscovici says in this paper, these often coexist quite peacefully in the textbooks of social psychology, and nobody seems to have noticed that there is actually a difference here. So in taxonomic social psychology, you have an undefined, undifferentiated subject, whereas the object is differentiated, usually into social or non-social. In differential, the subject's differentiated, usually by personality characteristics or something similar, while the object is not. And then finally, in systematic social psychology, we can see how the now famous subject-object triangle presented. And Moscovici provides examples of all of these different kinds of social psychology in this paper. And I think it's interesting to think now in today's social psychology climate, whether we can still see these divisions represented within social psychology, where there might be other forms of social psychology and so on. Do they continue to capture the breadth and the diversity of social psychology? If they do they continue to peacefully coexist, as Moscovici suggests in 1972, or is there now more tension between them? I'm aware that in this paper I'm probably raising more questions than I'm providing answers, but actually I'd be very interested to hear about the situation in your own countries. I personally feel that in the UK, differential psychology has gained a great deal of currency in recent years, especially through associations with personality psychology. Systematic social psychology would clearly include social representations theory, other theories within sociocultural psychology and so on too, but these are not necessarily found in mainstream social psychology textbooks. So at the heart of these different types is a different consideration, and this is the awareness and the definition of the social in social psychology. So the problem, as Moscovici sees it in 1972, is that the only form of social psychology that properly recognises the social is this systematic social psychology. It's the only kind that recognises it, as he so perfectly puts it, that we need to study behaviour in the social and not the social in behaviour. So we need to recognise the overarching and all-encompassing nature of the social in human development, behaviour, interaction, and so on. Now, this doesn't, contrary to some criticism, mean that there's no room for the individual, for resistance to social forces, for social change, and so on. And obviously that's very evident in a lot of Moscovici's other work, and the work that we've been discussing on social influence over the past 2 days as well demonstrates this very clearly, if anybody was in any doubt. But it does, I think, mean we need to return to this notion of the dialectical co-constructive relationship that's at the heart of the relationship between individual and social, the conflict, as Moscovici's referred to it elsewhere. And indeed, it's the reason why probably even framing our question in terms of a division between individual and social is unhelpful and unproductive in the first place. Two particular quotations from the 1972 paper stand out for me as summing this up, and I've included them on this slide here. So the first is it must not be forgotten that the individual is not a given but a product of society, because it is society that forces him to become an individual and to stress his individuality in his behaviour. And the second here, the individual is not a biological datum but a social product. Society is not an environment geared to training the individual and reducing his uncertainties, but a system of relationships between collective individuals. And again, my fear is that we've moved further, actually, into a social psychology that fails to consider this and to take this seriously, especially with the development of an increasing interest in biological approaches to psychology, in cognitive neuroscience, and so on. And obviously, the currency that some of those approaches have in the media and amongst the wider general public as well. And I don't want to deny that there is an importance to the biological and to the work that's going on there, but rather I want to emphasise that my perspective is that that can only ever be seen as part of a bigger picture. And I frequently return to, again, other people have mentioned this over the past 2 days as well. I frequently find myself returning to Doise's levels of analysis and explanation in social psychology when I'm reading papers and studies. And I think it remains rare to actually find papers that even acknowledge the limits to their focus, let alone those that actually try to take all of those levels into consideration. So ultimately, Moscovici's paper is also a call for much greater engagement of social psychology with social problems and social change. And I think, again, that's been an interesting recurring theme of the conference over the past 2 days. He argues that the discipline lacks dangerous truths. It doesn't engage in criticism of the social order. and as such has become, as he puts it, an isolated and secondary science. So I think we can also reflect on whether we've achieved this greater engagement in the last 44 years. Has this become social psychology's goal? Undoubtedly, there's been some very important and far-reaching work of this kind, and we've heard a lot about some of it again here in this conference. But also, I think in the UK, of work like Flora Cornish's work with sex workers in India, Sandra Jovcelovic, and Jackie Priego Hernandez's work with community organisations in favelas in Brazil, Skovdal and Belton's work on children with HIV in South Africa, Clifford Stott's work with crowds and policing in the UK and Scandinavia, and so on. But the question remains about whether we're sufficiently visible in a world that's facing so many issues and problems to which social psychology should and could contribute. We had a conference last year at the London School of Economics that I attended entitled The Vision for Social Psychology, and noted there, while we discussed and debated whether psychology was in yet another crisis, that social psychology isn't in the vanguard when it comes to addressing societal issues and social problems. We don't hold the place that we could and should in the minds of policymakers, or the public. We have theories, we have methods, we have studies, we have skills to contribute much to these, but we don't always do that, or not broadly as an entire discipline, even though there are clearly exceptions. As Moscovici says, our chances of progress and of renewal depend upon our ability to remain open to the problems of our collective reality. So, to conclude, I want to return to this idea of fractures and factions and tensions that did exist and still do exist within social psychology, and think about whether these are problematic, how far these are problematic. Do we still risk stunting the growth of the discipline if we actually just sit around bemoaning the fact of so much of what Moscovici was saying in 1972 might still seem to resonate with us today? Moscovici himself, of course, saw the importance of conflict as a background to the development of new forms of understanding on a sociogenetic level, as Devine and Lloyd also highlight. And like-minded developmental psychologists draw on the work of people like Piaget, who also highlight how conflict within interaction on the microgenetic level can also lead to new ways of thinking as well. And so perhaps we should draw more on these lessons ourselves in our own work at both the individual and the institutional level, and consider the possibilities of collaborative working and opportunities that they provide, as Zitoun, Gillespie and Cornish suggested in 2009 too. We talk a lot about social psychology's links to anthropology, sociology and so on, and I think that's really important. We should be talking about that, but what about our links? How do we link into other areas of psychology? And is that more of a possibility? So again, as I say, I'm going to end more with a question than with an answer, but I think thinking about how we can find ways to communicate between these factions and beyond these fractures, even if complicated, is potentially a way to achieve something of a solution to some of the problems that Moscovici highlights in this paper. Thank you.